Patrice Lumumba's speech, as excerpted here, is a powerful and evocative call to remember the struggles of African liberation and the necessity of true sovereignty. His words are not just a historical reflection, but a passionate plea for unity, self-determination, and vigilance against neo-colonialism. The speech resonates with urgency, emphasizing that independence was not merely a political formality, but a demand for complete control over Africa's destiny. Lumumba situates Africa's liberation within a broader historical struggle, referencing key figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Ahmed Ben Bella. His invocation of Nkrumah's famous declaration, "The freedom of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free," reinforces the Pan-Africanist vision that independence was incomplete if fragmented. He frames independence as a moral and divine imperative. The repetition of "I can hear" when recalling Nkrumah and Nyerere's words creates a haunting echo of lost unity.
I can hear Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere saying that he is prepared to delay the independence of Tanganyika so that Tanganyika, Kenya, Uganda would become independent at one time. Mwalimu could see the future with the exactitude of a Jewish prophet. Jomo Kenyatta and Obote could not. And therefore, we gained independence as separate states, and the story will be told shortly.
This elevates the struggle beyond politics, making it a universal human right. Throughout the ages, it was always the divine plan that men must be masters of their destiny, lamenting how quickly African leaders were assassinated. Sylvanus Olympio, Lumumba himself, after independence. Lumumba foreshadows the dangers of neo-colonialism. His speech serves as a prophetic warning that political freedom alone is insufficient without economic and cultural liberation. His vivid recollection of the 1963 Addis Ababa summit underscores both the hope and betrayal of post-colonial Africa. While Lumumba's speech is stirring, one might argue that it reflects an idealism that was already under siege by the realities of Cold War politics, coups, and economic exploitation. His lament over Africa's failure to unite fully remains pertinent today, as neo-colonialism persists in debt dependency, foreign military interventions, and resource exploitation. The powerful part of the speech is a wake-up call, a fiery indictment of how Africa's post-independence leaders abandoned the dream of unity and self-determination. The speaker doesn't hold back, exposing how the Organization of African Unity (OAU) became a weak, toothless body, far from Kwame Nkrumah's bold vision of a United States of Africa with one army, one currency, and real power. Instead of uniting, African leaders got comfortable in their palaces, drunk on power, while the people suffered. The speech paints a heartbreaking picture of decline, where once there was hope, corruption and dictatorship took over. Leaders like Mobutu Sese Seko, Idi Amin, and Jean Bedel Bokassa became symbols of greed and cruelty, looting their nations while calling themselves liberators. The Democratic Republic of Congo, rich beyond imagination, was reduced to begging for election funds. The so-called democratic republics became anything but democratic. What makes this speech so gripping is its raw honesty. The speaker doesn't just blame colonialism, they demand Africans face hard truths about failed leadership. The fiery tone makes you feel the urgency. Africa's leaders traded freedom for power, and the people paid the price. Yet beneath the anger, there's a challenge, a call to remember what was lost and fight for what could still be. This isn't just history, it's a warning. If Africa is ever to rise, it must break free from the messiah complexes of self-serving leaders and return to the unity and purpose that once inspired liberation. The speech leaves you with a burning question. Will Africa learn from its past or keep repeating the same mistakes? The next section of the speech is a raw, unflinching takedown of how Africa's liberation dreams were stolen by the very leaders meant to uphold them. The speaker pulls no punches, exposing a vicious cycle of corruption, incompetence, and outright theft that turned independence into a cruel joke for ordinary Africans. Where there should have been progress, there was looting, so rampant that the speaker mocks the absurd titles of self-aggrandizing leaders who declared themselves the leading farmer, singer, intellectual husband, while their people starved. The tragedy is visceral. Mothers still giving birth in mud huts, women walking miles for water, and young people fleeing humiliation at foreign embassies or drowning in the Mediterranean, all while politicians laundered money in Paris and bought mansions in London. The speech drips with irony as it contrasts the grand promises of independence with the grim reality. Hospitals without medicine, schools without budgets, and economies sabotaged by leaders who imported even mangoes from Europe. What makes this so powerful is its brutal honesty. The speaker doesn't just blame colonialism. They demand Africans confront the homegrown thieves who perfected looting on an industrial scale. The repetition of no hygiene in our politics becomes a haunting refrain, a reminder that rot starts at the top. The speech doesn't just describe failure, it dares listeners to rise up, reject these horribles masquerading as leaders, and reclaim the dignity stolen from them. A blistering, necessary rant, equal parts heartbreak and revolt. It doesn't just diagnose Africa's political sickness, it demands a cure. This speech is not just a historical artifact, but a living indictment of unfulfilled liberation. Lumumba's words demand that Africa remember its revolutionary past to confront present-day challenges.
The month of May 1963 was a weak organization of African unity, the OAU, which many commentators were quick to describe in many ways and many talking shop. Mzee Warioba, who was then active in political life and in other sectors, will attest to that. Yet later, we were to create another body, the African Union, and we'll have something to say about that. So we come out of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, clear as to what we want to do. The African politician begins to emerge. We have them in different parts, but they begin to show characters that are totally inimical to our expectations. You of the Swahili say, maskini akipata matako huliambwata. Maskini walipata matako zililiambwata. They started getting used to the trappings of power. And we started having countries which we thought would liberate us. And I'm talking about the hygiene of the politics. It started disappearing. Many of these individuals now thought that they were demigods, suffering from what I call the Messiah complex, thinking that they had been brought to Africa to liberate her, and that they suffered from two major diseases. One of them is the martyr syndrome, and the other one is the Messiah complex. They think that their countries owed them. Africa started producing leaders that one cannot recognize. How many of you will forget Jean Bedel Bokassa of Central African Republic, that man who murdered little children in the streets because they did not buy a uniform from his wife? That's Jean Bedel Bokassa. How many of you will forget Mobutu Sese Seko Kukumbendua? Oh, we ought to have elections, but we have no money to hold elections. When you see a country which has as its official name the Democratic Republic of Congo, know that there is no democracy. In fact, I dare say that any country, two countries that I know insisting on having as a part of their official name the Democratic Republic of something are never democratic. The other one is Korea, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. It's as if when you can't graduate to be a doctor, you go to the church and you ask to be baptized as Dr. Mwadime. But that is not the European musicians who had a little sense of guilt came to perform in Africa, Bob Geldof, to free education systems. Our young men and women were going to India because the budgets meant for education were consumed by individuals whom we had entrusted with the task of presiding over it. Our health sectors were beginning to collapse. And as I've said before, the political leadership did not have any faith in those institutions. Typically, the typical African politician, perhaps not in Tanzania today, if they were sick, they had a cold, they would not go to Muhimbili, they would go to London. If they were Kenyan, they would not go to Kenyatta Hospital, they would run to the United Kingdom. Tragedy, no hygiene in our politics, because Africans had started engaging in theft. In fact, I used to say that African politicians were thieves. Then I went to Uganda and I was told that they are not thieves, they are looters. And when I went to Liberia last week, I was told they are not looters. I was told they are looters on an industrial scale. That is the logical metamorphosis of the African politician whose appetite for public wealth is completely insatiable. Hygiene was disappearing from African politics, and we could see the effect of the disappearance of hygiene in African politics. But there was always the erstwhile colonial master to assist. Coup d'etats started visiting Africa. Modibo Keita in Mali was consumed. Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria was consumed. Diosagie for Kwame Nkrumah was consumed. Apollo Milton Obote was consumed. Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau was consumed. Patrice Lumumba was consumed. Coups were so frequent in Africa that Afro-pessimists were now hard to say that coups were as frequent as breakfast. But even breakfast was not frequent on African tables. We could not feed ourselves because there was no hygiene in African politics. Your typical African politicians took the view that they had a divine mission to preside over their countries. They arrogated to themselves the monopoly of wisdom. If you listen to some of them, and I listen to the radio announcements announcing the activities of one leader of an African country, Habyarimana Juvenal, it would take 3 minutes to say the things that he had done. He was the leading farmer. He was the leading singer. He was the leading intellectual. He was the leading husband. And he was the leading everything. We had monsterized our leaders and they became immune from any kind of advice. Meanwhile, the African was suffering. The African woman who thought that upon attainment of political independence, she would now deliver in a decent hospital was still the victim of a village midwife. The African woman was suffering. The African woman who thought that they would now get water in a tap in their homes was still running 5 kilometers away to get water. Meanwhile, our monster leaders were laundering their clothes in France and in Paris. The African woman who thought that they would go to Kariakoo market here in Dar es Salaam or Owino market in Kampala, Uganda, and get all the goodies could not get them because meanwhile, the Minister for Agriculture had agreed that bad seed be supplied, and meanwhile, we were getting mangoes from Europe. The African woman who thought that they could have food on the table could not have food on the table. We had killed all our sugar industries that we may have sugar from Brazil and Mexico. And the African youth was no different. The African youth who thought that upon realization of independence, there would be occasion for them to get employment was now being humiliated at the embassies of the United States of America as he struggled to get the almighty green card. The young African who thought that liberation would bring something new was now struggling at the United Kingdom embassy, filling a document that is 50 pages long, being asked who their great-great-grandfathers were and what enterprise they were engaged in. And they could not stop there. They went to the Australian embassy and to the French embassy, and the treatment was the same. The African youth was being treated like a leper, like a pariah, like a subhuman being. And they were asking, for what purpose did we gain this thing called independence? And those who were not humiliated in Gambia, in Nigeria, in Niger, were crossing the Red Sea, swimming across the Mediterranean to go to Italy so that they may be enslaved anew. Meanwhile, the African leader was busy looting from their countries and buying mansions in Paris and in London and in Florida, and driving private jets and helicopters and being addressed as their excellencies and honorables instead of being addressed properly as
His call for unity, self-governance and resistance against external domination remains as urgent now as it was in 1960. His thoughts were a masterful blend of history, prophecy and political urgency that continues to inspire and challenge.